Okay, so this chapter for the coming week is The Death of the Object, Move to Conceptualism. And we're going to be talking about late 1960 radicalist politics, institutional critique, and art povera. So I'm going to go through really quickly some of the frameworks for collectivist strategies in conceptual art. So you have Cobra, which your book talks about, that drew upon pre-war surrealism. It had an international scope and Marxist tendencies. It relied on the automatism of surrealists like Juan Miró, and established a commune in Bregenrad, excuse me. So it was a utopian alternative to a heroic individualism of abstract expressionism and the conformism of Stalinist realism. Then you had Letterism, which was countercultural provocation, or a bridge between Dada and the youth cults of the 1960s and 70s. You also had this example to the right, Oscar Jorn, Le Carnade Inquiétant, which is from the Modification series from 1959, which of course he would go and find sort of what were sort of bourgeoisie images from thrift shops and these sort of things. Then he would take them and radically alter them, as you see here. So one of the things that is sort of interesting that we should talk about is the Situationist Internationale. So there's a theorist named Guy Debord who says who is quoted inside your text as saying, everyday life with its alienated work routines and stultifying restrictions needed to be stultifying traditions needed to be interrogated as rigorously as class restrictions. So in this case, if we think about the idea of the spectacle, because Guy Debord writes about the spectacle, right? If we think about the fact that we looked at the end of the minimalist chapter and talked about the spectacle of art as being something like Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, right? So in the case of Tilted Arc, what happened was you had this giant piece of artwork which blocked out the view, which caused people to sort of have to go around it. And we talked about this in relationship to Michael Fried's work, right? Art as spectacle, right? So spectacle is basically anything, according to Debord, spectacle is basically anything that is a strategy which is meant to interfere in your life in order to direct you, right? So this can be things like bureaucracy in government, and you're meant to sort of go through these steps in order to get, for instance, in order to get paid, you need to prove your citizenship, and in order to prove your citizenship, you have to register your birth, etc., etc., right? So these are bureaucracies or structures that force your compliance in order to try and get regulation, or in order to regulate society. So the Situationist Internationale talks about these strategies as being present in sort of everyday life. So this idea that we're sort of free to do what we want is a myth, right? And to give you an idea about how this might work, say, for instance, you're trying to maneuver your way through Grant Park, right? And you want to go, and you've got all these public art pieces, like you've got the spitting faces in the form of the fountains. You've got the pedestrian bridge, which provides you access to the Art Institute and to cross over Monroe Street there. You've got all these things that are meant to direct your movement, right? So you've got Buckingham Fountain that discourages you from playing inside the fountain by having a fence up. And you've got the spitting fountains that encourage you to play inside and take part in as part of a public art work, by the fact that there are no fences, and the fact that there is a large space between these two areas that serves as sort of a splashing playground, right? In the case of the bridge, um, rather than causing difficulty for cars to maneuver their way down Monroe, you have this bridge, this pedestrian bridge that leads you across Monroe and then deposits you at the restaurant at the Art Institute of Chicago, right? So you're being directed to sort of come and partake of that before you can go in and enter and partake of the art, right? So these are the kind of things that are being called out by the Situationist International and said, hey, these are ways in which all sorts of institutions try and direct our movement and control our freedoms, right? So two of the ways that the Society of two of the ways that the Situationist International attempted to undermine the Society of the Spectacle was to say that first they would do dérivé, which would be to playfully disrupt um, these sort of structures in everyday life, and then through détournement, which was rearrangement or derailing of existed routines and sign systems. So they would do things like take the point A to point B most direct route, and refuse to sort of pay attention to traffic and any sort of obstructions. You see an example of something that they did to try and disrupt sort of daily living to the right, right? So there's a rejection of the aesthetic sphere as spectacle. And so human society and assumed reality, predicated on the shared culture inherited through many generations of tradition, humans ended up on those in those devastating wars because the culture itself was corrupt and pointless. So one had to somehow divorce themselves from that shared culture. Only then could they see existence clearly and live accordingly. So, in other words, the Situationist International was attempting to force us to see the sort of bureaucracy and spectacle that are often invisible inside our lives. So then the other institution that's talked about in conceptualism is institutional critique. They give the example of Marcel Broodthaers, who's Belgian. They talk about reification, which is the illusory sense that social relations or values are immutable, which leads to capitalist implantation of abstract values into material goods, right? So if we think about this, we can think about this in relationship to, for instance, do you like Pepsi or Coke? Are you a Pepsi or Coke person? Are you a Mac or a PC person, right? So we sort of add abstract values into things and say, well, Apple is counterculture. PC is business and has to do with the business world. So these are values that aren't necessarily inherent into the things that we're looking at, but we have a tendency to put values into material goods in that way. So one of the pieces that he had was the Department of Eagles, and he attempted to show sort of a correlation between these and the sort of the rise of the Nazi Party. So another example of institutional critique would be Hans Haack. Hans Haack's show at the Guggenheim was canceled after Daniel Bruhn's work was removed by the administration for impeding the viewing of other site-specific work by the American minimalists. Haack, in 1974, Hans Haack exhibited the corporate and business interests of the Guggenheim board. So his point was to point out the fact that museums are not neutral institutions, but are in fact extremely biased and have agendas and motivations of their own, right? So there's this idea that the white cube removes the context of an artwork and you're able to look at it in without the specific context. But people like Hans Hack and Marcel Bruyères would say that the institution of the museum itself is a biased unit. So an example of a more recent work, or a work of institutional critique that you guys may be familiar with, is Guarded View by Fred Wilson, which is inside, or was on view inside, the Whitney Museum. In this sense, Fred Wilson is trying to draw attention to the fact that frequently the only appearances of African Americans inside museums like these is in the form of the museum guards, right? So you frequently see African Americans as guards, but not as frequently as either artists hanging on the walls, which is starting to change, or as museum professionals. So this is a piece by Andrea, or a photograph from a piece by Andrea Fraser called Museum Highlights, a Gallery Talk from 1989. And it's the performance of Philadelphia Museum of Art. So what Andrea Fraser did in this case was she would go to the museum and she would find groups of people who were waiting for docents to be led through the museum, and she would take these unsuspecting folks on tours. And instead of going through and highlighting the pieces of artwork that were inside the museums that people were interested in coming to see, she would take them on tours and show them things like the bathrooms and the toilets and the fire extinguishers and the exit signs. And through humor, but also through sort of satire, point out the sort of institutional nature of the museum itself. Gordon Matta Clark, who we talked a little bit about inside class, he wanted to show that we were sort of passive and isolated as consumers. He thought that we were addicted to privacy and private property, and so he attempted to sort of expose the exterior structure of these things. He thought that ideology was all pervasive and at work in the very institution in which we're socialized. So he thought that race and gender contributed to a system that made it more difficult to figure out what to oppose. So then you have Art Povera, which was from the mid-1960s, Italian artists. It literally means poor art. They found that minimalists were narrowly prescriptive, and you have people like Germano Calant, who argued distinctively for heterogeneous, non-didactic art. So here you have an example of a piece which has a mirror on the wall, and there are people who are painted onto the mirror who are protesting the Vietnam War. And then when you go to view it, you see yourself as being part of the environment. So the artist is one who mixes himself with the environment and camouflages himself and enlarges his threshold of things. So Hopkins identifies Rauschenberg and Warhol and Smithson, who does Spiral Jetty, who he talks about in this chapter, as a point of transition out of a modernist paradigm. And he cites an apprehension of the disjuncture between linguistic signifiers and their reference. So words and rocks contain a language that follows a syntax of splits and ruptures. If you look at any word long enough, you'll see it open up into a sea of faults, into a terrain of particles. And he sees this as being synthesized in the work of Ian Hamilton Finlay. This is wave rock, right? And when you overlay these words on top of this photograph, which he shows in the book, which has a wave and a rock, these words make sense and are associated with their picture, but when you take them out of context, it changes.